I never thought the word old hag could cut through my soul like a blade, but when I heard it, loud and sharp, spat out by the woman who had stolen my husband, I felt every ounce of blood in my body turn to ice. We were at a company gala, lights glittering from chandeliers, champagne glasses clinking in people's hands, conversations humming like 1,000 bees, and yet the only sound that mattered was her voice, tearing me apart in front of everyone. I can still see the smirk on her painted lips, the cruel curve of satisfaction as she leaned closer to my husband, touching his arm with false tenderness, and then turned to me. "You're nothing but an old hag standing in the way," she said, each word like venom dripping into my veins. My husband didn't say a word. He didn't defend me, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, eyes averted, jaw tight, as if silence was easier than truth. That silence was worse than the insult itself. 40 years of marriage, decades of building a life together, and in that moment I was nothing but an inconvenient shadow. I stood frozen, my fingers wrapped so tightly around my wine glass that I feared it would shatter. Everyone around us pretended not to hear, but I knew they had. Eyes slid toward me and then darted away. Whispers forming like ripples on water. Humiliation crawled across my skin, hot and relentless. I felt like I was standing naked in the middle of that ballroom, exposed and ridiculed. And yet, even as I drowned in shame, a different fire sparked in me. Because while she thought she had the power, while she believed she had reduced me to nothing, I knew something she didn't. The company she flaunted, the empire she believed she had infiltrated through seduction, wasn't truly his. It wasn't hers, it was mine. My name was buried in dusty legal documents she had never seen. My signature was etched on papers she didn't know existed. While she saw me as weak, discarded, invisible, I was in fact the silent owner, the quiet architect of the very empire she thought she controlled. But at that moment, I didn't reveal it. I swallowed the insult, let the humiliation simmer in my chest, and walked away with what little dignity I could still hold in my trembling hands. And as I walked, the questions swirled in my mind, questions I whisper to you now because you deserve to know what it feels like to be betrayed, not just by a lover, but by the very person you trusted to share your life. Have you ever been reduced to nothing by someone who was supposed to love you? Have you ever been erased in public, treated like a ghost while your place was stolen in plain sight? That night, as I sat in my car outside the glittering building, makeup smeared with tears, hands trembling on the steering wheel, I realized something terrifying. My life wasn't what I thought it was. My marriage wasn't the safe harbor I had believed in. My husband wasn't the man who once swore under the stars to protect me until his last breath. He was a stranger. Worse, he was a coward standing silently beside my humiliation, letting his mistress spit venom at me while he looked away. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror, saw the broken woman staring back, and whispered aloud, "Is this all I am now? A fool clinging to memories while they tear my life apart?" But the mirror doesn't lie, and in my reflection I saw more than just pain. I saw something buried deep, something waiting to rise, because while they saw me as finished, I knew this was only the beginning. They thought I would stay silent forever, bow my head, and let them take everything I had built. But silence is not surrender. Humiliation is not defeat, and betrayal can awaken a strength even the betrayers never imagined. That strength was pulsing in my veins as I drove home. The city lights blurring through tears on the windshield. My mind raced back through decades of sacrifice. The nights I stayed awake sewing clothes to pay the rent while he built his dreams. The mornings I stood in line at the bank to negotiate loans under my name because he didn't want his credit at risk. The afternoons I carried crates of supplies, sweat pouring down my back, while he shook hands at meetings and played the role of a visionary. Every brick of that company was built with my blood, my labor, my endurance. Yet somehow, history had painted me as the silent wife, the background character, the old hag who didn't matter. The irony almost made me laugh, almost, because the truth was darker than irony. It was rage that burned through my humiliation and forged something unbreakable. I realized then that I would not only take back my dignity, I would take back everything they thought they had stolen. And when I did, I would do it in a way that would leave no shadow of doubt. When I was done, they wouldn't just regret betraying me, they would regret underestimating me. Do you understand what I'm saying? This isn't just a story about a mistress and a husband. This is a story about the moment a woman discovers her worth in the very ashes of her humiliation. The moment I stopped being their victim and became their reckoning. That night was the crack that split open the truth, the wound that revealed the power I had hidden all along. But I didn't rush. No, revenge, when it comes too quickly, burns out like cheap fireworks. I needed patience, I needed precision, and most of all, I needed silence. Because silence makes people careless. They thought I had accepted my fate, that I had swallowed their insult and gone back to my corner. But in my silence, I was watching. In my silence, I was listening. And in my silence, I was preparing. And so I kept their secret for a while longer. Let them believe they had won. I let her strut through parties, flaunting her youth and her arrogance, laughing with my husband as if she had conquered the world. I let him walk beside her, pretending his guilt wasn't eating him alive, pretending his silence was strength instead of cowardice. And I let the world whisper about me, the pitiful wife, the discarded woman. Because what none of them knew, not even for a second, was that the real storm was coming. I ask you, if someone took your place, humiliated you in public, called you an old hag while your husband stood by, would you simply fade into the shadows? Or would you find a way to rise, to claw your way back into the light and make them choke on their own cruelty? That was the question I asked myself over and over as I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside my window. Each night the answer grew clearer. I wouldn't fade, I wouldn't surrender, I wouldn't let them erase me, because I held the one thing they never suspected, the one weapon sharp enough to cut through all their lies: ownership. Real, undeniable, legal ownership. And when the time came, I would show them exactly who the old hag truly was. Not a discarded wife, not a powerless woman, but the hidden queen of the empire they had tried to steal. That insult, that night, that single word, they thought it was the end of me, but it was only the beginning. And what came next, I promise you, would turn their laughter into screams. The first crack in the facade came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I remember it so vividly because of how banal the day felt before everything began to shift. I was folding laundry in the living room, the hum of the washing machine filling the silence, when his phone buzzed on the coffee table. Normally, I wouldn't dare touch it. For 40 years, I had been the kind of wife who believed in privacy, who thought trust was a sacred bond not to be violated. But that day, something about the way the phone trembled against the wood made my stomach twist. My instincts, honed through decades of love and disappointment, screamed at me to look. The screen lit up with a message preview. "See you at 7, my love. Don't be late." My heart stopped. I stared at those words as though they were written in fire. My love. The simplicity of it made it even crueler. It wasn't darling or sweetheart, words he had once reserved for me. It was sharper, fresher, glowing with intimacy, and it wasn't meant for me. I picked up the phone with trembling hands, but by the time I swiped to open it, the message had disappeared, deleted. My chest tightened. That meant he had been doing this for a long time, careful enough to erase his tracks. He'd always called himself clumsy with technology, had laughed about being too old to understand apps or messaging, but suddenly I realized it wasn't clumsiness. It was a mask. He knew exactly what he was doing. I put the phone back where it was, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. I sat back on the sofa, my folded laundry falling apart in my lap, and listened to the pounding of my heart. 40 years, I whispered to myself. 40 years of believing in a man who now had a secret life. That evening, when he came home, I watched him like a stranger. He tossed his jacket on the chair, loosened his tie, and sighed as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "Tough day at the office?" he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I forced a smile, nodded, and placed dinner on the table. But my ears were no longer tuned to his words. They were tuned to the details, the faint scent of a perfume that wasn't mine, the tiny fleck of lipstick on his cuff, the way his eyes darted to his phone like a man afraid of missing something important. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the chasm between us widen. In the past, his snores had been a lullaby, proof that life was safe and steady. Now they sounded like mockery, like the rhythm of lies echoing in the dark. The next day, I decided to test him. I placed his favorite dinner on the table, roast chicken with rosemary, the one that used to make his eyes light up when we were young. I waited for him to come home. 7 o'clock passed, then 8, then 9. Finally, at 10, he stumbled in, smelling of whiskey and perfume. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie gone. He kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly, the way you pat a dog, and muttered, "Sorry, meeting ran late." I looked at the untouched dinner, the candle I had lit now nothing but melted wax, and asked softly, "Was the meeting worth it?" He paused, his back to me, and for a split second I saw the guilt stiffen his shoulders. But then he recovered, chuckled, and said, "Of course. You know how demanding clients can be." He walked away before I could reply. The next morning, I found a faint receipt in his jacket pocket. A fancy restaurant downtown, 2 entrees, a bottle of champagne, not a business dinner, a date. My fingers trembled as I stared at the paper, the ink smudging under the pressure of my grip. I could feel the storm building inside me, but I said nothing. Not yet. Silence was my shield. It was the small things that began to pile up after that. A new cologne, sharper and younger, replacing the one he had worn for years. A gym membership he claimed was for his health, though I knew he barely used the treadmill in our garage. A sudden obsession with his phone, which never left his side. At family dinners, he was distracted, smiling at messages under the table while pretending to listen to our son's stories. I saw the distance growing, not just between him and me, but between him and our family. I began to feel invisible. Once, when we were first married, he used to call me from work just to hear my voice. Now days would pass without a single word. And when he did speak, it was as if he was rehearsing lines from a script, words empty of warmth, stripped of meaning. One night, I decided to follow him. I waited until he left the house with the excuse of another meeting. My heart pounded as I slipped into my car and kept a safe distance. The city lights flickered against my windshield as I trailed him through crowded streets. Finally, he pulled up to a restaurant I had never seen before. I parked across the street, my hands cold on the steering wheel. I saw her for the first time that night. She stepped out of a sleek black car, her hair perfectly styled, her heels clicking against the pavement like the beat of war drums. She was younger, yes, but not by much. Still, the way she carried herself, the way she leaned into him as if she already owned him, made me feel like I had aged 20 years in an instant. I watched as he placed his hand on the small of her back, a gesture he hadn't given me in decades. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. They walked into the restaurant together, laughing, and I sat there in the dark, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. When he came home that night, reeking of wine and perfume, I said nothing. I simply smiled, asked how the meeting went, and listened to his lies. Inside, I was screaming, but outside, I was silence. Because silence, I was beginning to understand, is the sharpest blade of all. And so round one had begun. The first discoveries, the undeniable proof that the man I had loved for 40 years was no longer mine. Each sign was a nail in the coffin of our marriage, each clue a match struck in the dark. And while I felt myself breaking, a small, fierce part of me began to grow stronger. Because with every lie he told, I learned how to see the truth. And with every humiliation I endured, I was building the fire I would one day unleash. The truth has a way of creeping out, even when the liars think they are safe. It seeps through cracks in conversations, hides in the glances people exchange, slips between the lines of silence. After weeks of swallowing my humiliation, of collecting tiny fragments of his betrayal like shards of broken glass, I was given a piece I hadn't expected, from someone who still remembered the woman I once was. It happened on a Thursday afternoon at the market. I was carrying a basket of vegetables, trying to act like life was normal when I heard a familiar voice call my name. "Marianne?" I turned, and there she was. Caroline, an old colleague from the early days when I worked part-time at the company before stepping aside so he could shine. We hadn't seen each other in years, but her eyes lit up with recognition. We exchanged pleasantries, spoke about families, about how time had flown, but then her smile faltered, her gaze shifting, as if she was debating whether to say something. Finally, she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "I probably shouldn't say this, but I've seen your husband at some of the recent corporate events." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course. He's always busy." But Caroline didn't return the smile. Her brow furrowed, and I could see the weight of hesitation pressing on her. "He wasn't alone, Marianne. He's been accompanied." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. My throat tightened. I wanted to pretend ignorance, to smile and walk away, but the tremor in her voice told me she already knew the truth I had been trying to bury. "Accompanied?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She sighed, her eyes full of pity. "A woman, younger, very bold. She acts like she owns the place when she walks into those rooms with him. People talk, Marianne. They whisper. Some think she's his business partner. Others—" Her voice trailed off. I didn't need her to finish. I felt the words, even if she couldn't bring herself to say them. Mistress, lover, thief. I steadied myself, gripping the edge of the market stall as though it could keep me from falling. "Did anyone else notice?" I asked. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. "Everyone notices. Some pretend not to because of who he is, but the whispers are spreading. I thought you should know." I thanked her, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. I walked away, the vegetables heavy in my basket, but the truth heavier still. Each step felt like walking through quicksand. Every movement dragging me deeper into a reality I had tried so hard to deny. That evening, I confronted him, not with accusations, but with silence. I served dinner, placed his glass of wine in front of him, and simply watched. He shifted in his chair under my gaze, fidgeting with his fork, glancing at the clock as though he longed to be anywhere but here. Finally, I asked softly, "Do people still talk about us at your company events?" He froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. For a moment, panic flickered across his eyes. Then he forced a laugh. "What kind of question is that? Of course not. Why would they?" But his voice was too quick, too defensive, and I knew. I knew without a doubt that Caroline's whispers were not gossip. They were confirmation. Later that night, as he pretended to sleep beside me, I lay awake replaying Caroline's words. "She acts like she owns the place." That phrase haunted me, because deep down I feared it wasn't just his heart she wanted. It was everything. The company, the wealth, the life I had helped build with my bare hands. Over the next week, I began to notice more signs that echoed Caroline's warning. A new expense report left carelessly on his desk showed dinners at upscale restaurants, boutique hotels booked under business travel, credit card statements with jewelry purchases I had never received. Each line item was a confession, written in numbers, a breadcrumb trail of deceit. I photographed them all with my phone, storing the evidence quietly like a soldier stockpiling weapons for a war no one else knew was coming. Then came the night I truly understood the depth of his betrayal. We were invited to a corporate gala, one of those glittering evenings where appearances mattered more than truth. I dressed in my best gown, the one he used to say made me look radiant. But when I stepped into the room beside him, I felt like a ghost. Eyes turned toward us, but not with admiration. There was pity in their glances, smirks hidden behind champagne glasses, whispers buzzing in corners. I could feel it, the way one feels the cold before a storm. And then she arrived. She walked in like a queen claiming her throne. Her dress clung to her like liquid fire, her heels clicking against marble floors, her smile a blade aimed directly at me. And she didn't hesitate. She walked straight to my husband, laid her hand on his arm, and kissed him on the cheek, lingering just long enough for the cameras flashing in the room to capture it. The crowd gasped softly, a ripple of scandal spreading through the air. My husband stammered, trying to disguise it as a greeting, but the damage was done. Whispers exploded, laughter hidden behind polite coughs. I stood there, humiliated, my hands trembling as I clutched my glass of champagne. And then it came. Her voice, clear and sharp, dripping with cruelty. "Why is she still here?" she asked, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Everyone knows she's nothing but an old hag clinging to the past." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that devours sound. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet, my dignity crumbling. My husband didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He just tightened his jaw, let her words hang in the air, and said nothing. In that moment, I understood everything Caroline had tried to warn me about. This wasn't just an affair. This was an invasion. She wasn't satisfied with taking my husband. She wanted to erase me completely, to step into my place, to take what was mine as if I had never existed. I left the gala early, my heels clicking against the pavement outside, tears blurring the city lights. In the quiet of my car, I gripped the steering wheel and whispered to myself, "They think they can erase me, but they have no idea who I really am." The whispers had become public humiliation. The shadows of betrayal had become glaring lights of exposure. And though I felt like I was drowning, a part of me knew this was only round 2. The escalation had begun, and the storm was gathering. There's a kind of pain that doesn't scream, that doesn't bleed, that doesn't bruise. It lingers quietly like a slow poison dripping into your veins, killing you from the inside, while the world applauds the very people who are destroying you. That was the kind of pain I lived with in round 3. The pain of isolation, of being erased in my own home, of watching the people I loved most drift toward the very woman who had called me an old hag. After the gala, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder. In the supermarket, women I had known for years avoided my eyes, their pity as sharp as their judgment. At church, conversations fell silent when I walked into the pews. It was as if my humiliation had become entertainment, a story people retold with a shake of their heads. The faithful wife replaced by a younger flame. Such a common tragedy. And yet when it was my life, it felt like the end of the world. But what cut deepest wasn't the whispers of strangers. It was the silence of my own family. My son, Daniel, who had once clung to my hand as a boy, now seemed distant, distracted whenever we spoke. He didn't look me in the eye the way he used to. At dinner, when I tried to ask about his work, his answers were short, clipped. And once, I caught him exchanging a message on his phone and smiling faintly. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. He was talking to her. The mistress had found her way not only into my husband's life, but into my son's. She had a gift for manipulation, for wrapping men around her finger until they couldn't see the truth, even if it were carved into stone. Slowly, she was positioning herself as the new matriarch, the woman who would inherit everything I had built. I remember one evening vividly. We were all gathered for what was supposed to be a family dinner. My husband insisted on inviting her, claiming it was for business, that she was helping with a new strategy for the company. I sat at the table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, as she walked in, wearing a red dress that seemed deliberately chosen to ignite my humiliation. She sat beside my husband, laughing loudly, touching his arm, and speaking as if I weren't even there. And then she turned her attention to Daniel. "You have such potential," she told him, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Your father believes in you. I believe in you, but you need to stop clinging to the past. You need to think about the future. Don't let nostalgia hold you back." Her eyes flicked toward me as she said it, the word nostalgia like a dagger aimed straight at my heart. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't defend me. He didn't say a word. My husband, of course, smiled proudly at her as though she were some kind of visionary. And me? I sat there, invisible at my own table, listening as the woman who had stolen everything lectured my son about loyalty, about legacy, about ambition. Later that night, as I washed the dishes alone, I heard them laughing in the living room, my husband, my son, and her, laughing together while I stood at the sink with soap on my hands and tears in my eyes. The sound of their laughter was worse than any insult. It was proof that I was being replaced. The isolation spread like wildfire. Friends stopped visiting. Invitations stopped arriving. Even my sister, who had always been my confidant, grew distant. She told me once over the phone, "Maybe you're being too dramatic, Marianne. Men stray, women age, it's just life." Just life. As if my pain were nothing but a cliché. As if I should accept it quietly, like a broken appliance that can't be fixed, but I couldn't accept it. I wouldn't. Because every humiliation, every cold glance, every night of silence in my home was fuel for something greater. The breaking point came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread, trying to lose myself in the familiar rhythm when I heard footsteps behind me. It was her. She had come over unannounced, as if this were her home. My husband followed behind, smiling nervously, as though he feared confrontation. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the kitchen like a queen surveying her territory. "You really should modernize this place," she said casually. "It's so outdated." No wonder he's tired of being here. I froze, my hands still in the dough. "Excuse me?" She smirked. "Oh, don't act surprised. You know as well as I do that you've lost him. And soon this company, this family, this house, they'll all move forward without you. You're just holding everyone back." My husband said nothing. He didn't even look at me. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, letting her spit poison into my kitchen. For the first time, I felt something inside me shatter completely. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It wasn't just humiliation. It was erasure. She was telling me, to my face, that I no longer existed. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the dough at her, to hurl every dish in the kitchen, to demand my husband defend me. But instead, I did what I had been doing for weeks. I stayed silent, because silence, I knew, was power. Let her think she had won. Let him think his cowardice had gone unnoticed. I was listening. I was watching. And one day, they would choke on their arrogance. That night, I cried harder than I had in years. Alone in my room, I pressed my face into the pillow and let the sobs rip through me until I couldn't breathe. But when the tears dried, something else remained: resolve. Because if they wanted to erase me, they would soon learn I was carved into the very foundation of everything they thought they owned. And nothing Not insults, not whispers, not betrayal could erase what was mine. Round 3 left me bruised, abandoned, mocked, and isolated. But it also left me sharper, colder, stronger. They thought they had broken me. What they had done was awaken the storm. Every storm has its darkest hour, the moment when the sky turns so black you can't remember what light ever looked like. Round 4 was that hour for me. After weeks of whispers, after being humiliated in public, after being mocked in my own kitchen, I reached the edge of collapse, and for a while, I believed they had won. It began with a letter. A thick envelope slipped under my door one morning, addressed not to me, but to my husband. I bent to pick it up, curiosity pricking at my fingers, and when I saw the return address, an attorney's office downtown, my heart seized. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that. But something inside me already knew this wasn't a coincidence. My instincts told me this letter was meant to be seen by me. Inside was a draft of a new agreement, the transfer of company shares. My husband was preparing to sign over control to her, his mistress, the very woman who had spit on my dignity. Not a rumor, not whispers, but legal proof. My name wasn't even mentioned. Decades of sacrifice erased with the stroke of a pen. I remember sitting at the dining table with that letter in my hands, the morning sun filtering through the curtains, illuminating the words like scripture from hell. My fingers trembled, the paper shaking so hard I thought it might tear. "So this is it," I whispered to the empty room. "They're going to erase me completely." I couldn't breathe. My chest ached. My vision blurred. The walls of the house, once filled with memories, now felt like a prison closing in on me. I thought of the early years when he and I had struggled together, when I sold my jewelry to cover payroll, when I worked nights sewing clothes to keep the lights on. All of it, every sacrifice, every dream, now stolen by a woman who had done nothing but seduce him. I wanted to fight, but for the first time in my life, I felt powerless. I was a ghost haunting my own home, a shadow in the company I had helped build. That night, I collapsed into bed without eating. My body shook with sobs until exhaustion swallowed me. The next day, the humiliation deepened. My husband announced he would be traveling for a business retreat with his executives. But I knew she would be there. I could feel it in my bones. When he left, suitcase in hand, he didn't even glance at me. No kiss, no goodbye, just silence. For 3 days, I wandered the house like a widow. The rooms felt foreign, the air heavy. I barely ate, barely slept. And then, the phone rang. It was Caroline again. Her voice trembling. "Marianne, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to tell you, but I saw them. At the resort. They weren't hiding. They were walking hand in hand, laughing, introducing her as his partner. People think she's the new Mrs. Roberts." The words struck me like lightning. The new Mrs. Roberts. It was as though I had already been buried, my place stolen before my body was even cold. I dropped the phone, sank to the floor, and pressed my forehead to the tiles. I didn't cry this time. I couldn't. The pain had gone beyond tears. It was a hollow ache, a numbness that devoured everything. That night, I sat in the dark. A bottle of wine half empty beside me, staring at the photos on the mantel. My wedding picture, faded and yellowing, family portraits from happier days, our son's graduation, memories frozen in frames, mocking me with the illusion of a life that no longer existed. Who am I now? I whispered to the silence. A wife without a husband, a mother without her son's loyalty, a woman without a place. The silence answered with nothing, and for the first time, I thought of giving up, of walking away, leaving it all behind, letting them have their victory. It would have been so easy to disappear, to become the shadow they already believed me to be. But then, something happened. A memory rose up from the ashes of my despair. I saw myself younger, standing in our first office, a shabby little room with peeling paint and a single desk. He had been discouraged, ready to quit, and it was me who had said the words that kept us going. If we quit now, we'll regret it forever. We fight, we endure, we build. Those words echoed in my mind, stronger than the silence around me. And in that echo, I remembered something I had almost forgotten. The company wasn't his. It wasn't hers. It was mine. My name was on the founding documents, tucked away in an old file cabinet. My signature was inked into contracts he had long dismissed. The empire they thought belonged to him had roots in me. That realization hit me like a surge of electricity. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't erased. They had only blinded me with humiliation, hoping I would forget who I really was. But I remembered now. The despair began to harden into something else. Resolve. I wiped the tears from my face, pushed the bottle of wine away, and stood. My legs trembled, but I forced them to move. I walked to the drawer in the study where I had kept old papers, searching through dust and forgotten files until I found it. A folder thick with documents, agreements, receipts, certificates. And there it was, proof that the largest block of shares had been placed in my name decades ago when he had asked me to hold them for security. I laughed then, a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed through the empty house, because the weapon I needed had been in my possession all along. While he paraded his mistress around, while she mocked me, while the world pitied me, I had been the true power, hidden, silent, but still power. The darkness of round 4 nearly swallowed me. I almost gave up, almost surrendered to the weight of betrayal. But in the ashes of despair, I found the seed of my revenge. And as I closed that folder, clutching it to my chest like armor, I whispered into the silence, "They think they've broken me. They think I'm finished. But they have no idea what's coming." Round 4 was supposed to be my collapse. Instead, it became the moment I remembered who I truly was. The old hag, the ghost, the erased wife. She was gone. What remained was a woman reborn, carrying the truth like a sword. And soon, I would wield it. The night I found the folder was the night everything shifted. Up until then, I had been the victim in this story. The wife who was lied to, the woman mocked in her own home, the ghost sitting silently at the edges of her family. But as I held those papers in my hands, I realized I wasn't powerless. I wasn't erased. I was the storm they hadn't seen coming. For hours, I sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of me. Legal contracts, share certificates, financial statements, all bearing my name. My husband had been so eager to protect his reputation years ago, he'd asked me to sign as guarantor, to hold the shares under my name temporarily. Temporary had become permanent, and permanent had become my salvation. I traced my finger over my signature, written in the bold handwriting of a younger me, a woman still full of dreams. Tears pricked my eyes, not from sadness this time, but from a kind of fierce pride. That girl hadn't been erased. She had been waiting, silently, for her moment to return. The next morning, when my husband came home from his so-called business retreat, I didn't confront him. I greeted him with coffee, kissed his cheek, and asked if he was tired. He smiled, relieved, as if he believed I was still blind. And I let him think that. I let him carry his lies like a crown, let him believe he had already won, because I knew that soon I would rip that crown from his head in front of everyone. But I couldn't act too quickly. Revenge is like baking bread. You need patience, heat, and timing. Move too soon and it collapses. Wait just long enough and it rises into something unstoppable. So I began to plan. First, I gathered more evidence, quietly, carefully, without a hint of suspicion. I searched drawers, closets, briefcases. I found hotel receipts, restaurant bills, credit card charges for gifts I never received. I photographed them all, storing them on a hidden drive. Then, I reached out to Caroline. Over coffee, I told her just enough to make her understand. Her eyes widened as she listened. "Marianne, you can't let them do this to you," she whispered. "If you need anything, contacts, lawyers, I'll help." Her offer was more than kindness. It was an anchor. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. Second, I studied the enemy. I attended the same corporate events I had been avoiding, dressed not in mourning, but in quiet elegance. I watched her, how she spoke to the board members, how she flirted with investors, how she tried to play the role of the future queen, and I listened. People are careless when they underestimate you. They spoke freely around me, assuming I was irrelevant. But every careless word was fuel. "She's pushing him to restructure the company," one whispered. "She acts like she's already the new Mrs. Roberts," another muttered. "She wants the whole empire," someone else said, shaking their head. They thought they were gossiping. What they didn't realize was that they were handing me her playbook. Third, I began to prepare my reveal. I contacted a lawyer I trusted, a man who had once worked with me when we were building the company from scratch. His eyes widened as I showed him the documents. "Marianne," he said, his voice firm, "these shares give you majority control. You're not just part of this company. You are this company." The words sent a shiver through me. For the first time in years, I felt power in my hands, real and undeniable. I asked him to help me draft the paperwork to solidify my position, to prepare for the day when the truth would come crashing down on them. At night, lying beside my husband as he slept, I listened to his steady breathing and felt no love, no longing, only resolve. He thought his silence protected him. He thought his lies kept me blind. But I saw everything. And soon, everyone else would too. I didn't fantasize about screaming at him or throwing him out. That would have been too small, too private. No, I wanted the world to know. I wanted her to choke on her arrogance in front of the very people she had tried to impress. I wanted him to drown in the shame of realizing he had underestimated the woman he thought was finished. And so, the victim in me began to fade. In her place rose a strategist, a fighter, a woman with a plan. Every insult, every humiliation had become fuel. Every tear I had shed was now steel in my spine. I wasn't just waiting for revenge, I was orchestrating it. And when the moment came, it wouldn't just be a confrontation, it would be a reckoning. Because here is the truth they never understood. You can betray a woman's love. You can mock her age. You can even steal her husband. But if you try to erase her, if you try to take what she built with her own hands, then you awaken something far more dangerous. They thought they were playing a game. They thought I was already defeated, but I was about to remind them that the queen is the most dangerous piece on the board. And I promise you this, when the storm finally broke, it would leave nothing but ashes behind. The day of our private confrontation began like any other, and maybe that's what made it so cruel. The sun rose, the city bustled, the world spun on as if my life weren't about to split open. I had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in my head, what I would say, how I would look, the silence I would wield like a blade. But when the hour finally came, my heart still pounded like a trapped bird. He was in his office, the door half open, a glass of whiskey sweating on the desk, though it was barely noon. I stepped inside quietly, my heels clicking against the hardwood. He looked up, startled, then tried to mask it with that familiar, weary smile. "Marianne," he said, his voice too casual. "I didn't expect you." "No," I replied, closing the door behind me. "You didn't." For a moment, the silence between us stretched, heavy as lead. He shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie, his eyes flicking to the pile of papers on his desk. Contracts, agreements, lies written in ink. I let my gaze rest there before meeting his eyes again. I know, I said simply. His smile faltered. Know what? That you're giving her everything. That you've been parading her around as if she already wears my name. That you've been planning to erase me. The color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, stopping him. My voice was steady, calm in a way that frightened even me. Don't insult me with more lies, not after 40 years. I've seen the receipts, the contracts, the way she clings to you like a trophy. I've heard the whispers, felt the humiliation. I know. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. For a moment, I thought I saw regret flicker across his features, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by something colder. Marianne, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, I cut in. My voice sharp as glass. You wanted to trade me in for a younger model. Fine, men have done worse, but you didn't just betray me, you tried to erase me. And that, Julian, is unforgivable. The sound of her heels announced her arrival before the door even opened. She stepped inside without knocking, her perfume preceding her like a declaration of war. She wore a tailored suit, sharp and immaculate, her lips painted the color of blood. When she saw me, she smirked. Well, she said, tossing her purse onto the couch, if it isn't the old hag herself, what a surprise. I didn't flinch. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I turned toward her slowly, my eyes locking onto hers with a calm that made her smirk falter. Careful, I said softly. Mockery is a fragile weapon when you don't know who you're dealing with. She laughed, a sharp sound that bounced off the walls. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A relic. A woman who should have stepped aside years ago. Do you know what people call you at these events? They call you invisible. A shadow. You don't belong here anymore. And you do? I asked, my voice low, dangerous. Her smile widened, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Of course I do. I'm the future. I have him. I have the company. And soon, I'll have everything. Julian shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us, sweat beading at his temple. Let's not, he began, but I silenced him with a look. You really believe that, don't you? I said to her, stepping closer, my heels echoing with each deliberate stride, that you've already won, that you've taken my husband, my family, my life. You think because you called me an old hag in front of a crowd that you've broken me. But here's what you don't understand. I leaned forward close enough that I could see the pulse racing in her neck. My voice dropped to a whisper meant to slice through her arrogance. I built this. Every brick, every dollar, every dream. While you were playing dress-up, I was bleeding for this company. You didn't win him. You inherited my sacrifices. And if you think you can erase me, you've already lost. Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But she recovered quickly, tossing her hair back. Words, Marianne. That's all they are. Words. At the end of the day, the contracts will be signed, and you'll be nothing but a memory. I smiled then, not with humor, but with the kind of smile that promised thunder. Slowly, I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder that had become my weapon, my salvation. I placed it on the desk between us and slid it toward her. What's this? She asked, her voice sharp. Proof, I replied. She flipped through the documents, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as her eyes scanned the pages. The color drained from her face. Julian leaned over her shoulder, his own expression collapsing into disbelief. No, he whispered. This can't be. It is, I said, my voice steady, cold as steel. Majority shares, in my name, signed, sealed, and never revoked. While you were busy humiliating me, while you were so sure you'd already won, I was holding the one thing you can never take. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. She dropped the papers onto the desk as if they had burned her fingers. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide with something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. You planned this, he said, his voice hoarse. No, I corrected. You planned your betrayal. I simply remembered who I was. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw them both stripped of their arrogance. She, the mistress who thought she could take everything, now pale and trembling. He, the husband who thought I was weak, now confronted with the truth that I was stronger than both of them combined. I gathered the papers back into the folder, tucking it into my bag with deliberate care. "This was your private warning," I said, my tone final. "Next time it will be public, and when it is, the humiliation you gave me will be nothing compared to what's coming for you." I turned to leave, my steps steady, my back straight. Behind me, I heard her hiss. "You can't do this. We'll fight you." I paused at the door, looked back over my shoulder, and let my words cut through the room like a blade. "You already did, and you lost." Then I walked out, closing the door behind me, leaving them in a silence louder than any scream. Climax 1 was done. The private battlefield had been won. But I knew the war wasn't over. The real confrontation was still to come, not in whispers, not in secret rooms, but in the glaring light of public reckoning. And I was ready. The boardroom was a battlefield dressed in glass and steel. Long mahogany table, leather chairs, city skyline stretching behind tall windows. I had walked through those doors countless times in the past, always as a silent wife, a background figure brought out for photographs and polite smiles. But that day, I entered as something else entirely. My heels struck the polished floor like drums announcing war. Heads turned, voices hushed, and even before I spoke a word, the room knew. Something was about to break. At the head of the table sat Julian, his suit crisp, his expression rehearsed. To his right, she perched with the poise of a queen about to be crowned, her lips curved in that arrogant smirk I had come to know too well. Papers were spread before them, contracts, agreements, signatures that would supposedly finalize her rise and my erasure. Julian cleared his throat, addressing the room of shareholders and executives. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, "today marks a new chapter for this company. We have exciting transitions to announce. As you know, my partner," he glanced at her, "has been instrumental in steering us toward a bold future. And with the signing of these agreements, she will assume a more official role." There were polite nods, some murmurs of approval, some thinly veiled skepticism. But no one dared speak against him. He had cultivated fear as much as respect. And then I stepped forward. "Before any signatures are inked," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade, "perhaps we should review who actually holds the authority to make such announcements." Every head turned. Silence fell like a curtain. Julian's face blanched, her smirk froze. I walked to the end of the table, placed my bag on the polished wood, and slowly withdrew the folder that had become my weapon. Julian rose halfway from his chair. "Marianne, this isn't—" "Sit down," I said quietly, but with such finality that even he obeyed. I spread the documents across the table one by one, my fingers steady. "For decades, you've all believed that Julian Roberts held majority control. But the truth is, those shares were transferred long ago, signed into my name. I didn't flaunt it because I trusted him. I stayed silent because I believed in family. But when silence is mistaken for weakness, when trust is repaid with betrayal, silence ends." Gasps rippled through the room. Shareholders leaned forward, eyes wide. Executives whispered furiously to one another. She shifted in her seat, color draining from her cheeks. "That's impossible," she snapped. "You're bluffing. Everyone knows what you wanted them to know," I interrupted, my gaze locking onto hers. "But what they didn't know, what you didn't know, is that this company is mine, legally, irrevocably, signed and sealed." I pointed to the signatures on the contracts. My younger handwriting stared back at me, bold and certain. "This is my empire. You've been playing house in a palace you never owned." The room erupted. Voices rose, questions flew, And in the chaos, I remained steady, a pillar in the storm. For the first time in months, I felt seen, not as the invisible wife, not as the old hag, but as the rightful queen of the table. Julian's voice cracked through the noise. "Marianne, please, let's talk about this privately. We don't need—" "No," I said, my voice like iron. "We will talk about it here, in front of everyone. Because you humiliated me in public, Julian. You let her mock me, erase me, laugh at me in the open. Now the truth will be just as public." I turned to her, my eyes sharp enough to cut. "Do you remember the gala? When you called me an old hag in front of half the city? Do you remember the look on your face when you thought you had already won? That was the moment you lost. Because arrogance blinds, and you never thought to look at the documents, never thought the woman you dismissed could be the one holding everything you wanted." She rose to her feet, her hands slamming the table. "You can't do this. You don't have the courage. You don't have—" I cut her off by sliding one last document across the table. A series of photographs, messages, receipts, proof of her manipulation, her schemes, her affair with my husband. Gasps filled the room again, louder this time. "You didn't just seduce a man," I said, my voice steady. "You tried to seduce an empire, and you failed." Julian's face crumpled as the executives turned their eyes on him. Disgust and disbelief painted across their features. "You let this happen?" one demanded. "You risked the company for her?" He stammered, words tumbling uselessly. I didn't—" But no one listened. The tide had turned, and it was irreversible. I gathered the papers back into my folder, snapping it shut with finality. "This board answers to me now. Effective immediately. All pending transfers are void. Any agreements signed without my consent are invalid. And as of today, she is banned from this building." Security guards at the door moved instinctively, waiting for my signal. She stared at me, her face twisted with rage, her voice rising to a shriek. "You can't get rid of me. He loves me. He'll choose me over you." I looked at Julian, his shoulders sagging, his eyes hollow. "Choose," I said simply. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes darted between me and her, caught in the trap of his own cowardice. Finally, he sank back into his chair, head in his hands. He had chosen nothing, and in doing so, he had chosen me. Because silence once again spoke louder than anything he could have said. She screamed, lunged toward him, but the guard stepped in. Her voice echoed through the boardroom, curses and threats spilling into the air as they dragged her out. The door slammed behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. I turned back to the board, to the shareholders, to the people who had once looked past me. "This company will no longer be run on arrogance and betrayal," I said. "It will be run on the foundation it was built on, hard work, sacrifice, and truth. If anyone cannot accept that, you may leave now." No one moved. I gathered my folder, stood tall, and walked to the head of the table. For the first time, I sat in the chair that had always been denied to me. My hands rested on the polished wood, steady, certain. The room was silent, every eye fixed on me, not with pity, but with respect. That was the public reckoning. That was the explosion. The moment when everything they had tried to steal turned to ash in their hands. And as I sat there, reclaiming what was mine, I realized something deeper. Revenge wasn't about destroying them. It was about remembering who I was all along. The queen had never left the board. She had simply been waiting for her move. News travels faster than fire, and when the flames of truth catch dry wood, they spread until there is nothing left but smoke and ash. What happened in that boardroom didn't stay in those glass walls. It spilled out into the streets, into whispers at cafes, into headlines that traveled further than I ever imagined. By the time I walked out of the building that day, phone cameras were already raised. Shareholders who had once ignored me now whispered to reporters in hushed voices. their words spilling like gasoline on open flames. "She owns the company," one executive murmured to a journalist. "It was her all along." Another, more bitter, confessed, "The mistress thought she could take everything, but she underestimated the wife." By evening, the news channels were buzzing. Headlines scrolled across the screen. "Wife emerges as hidden majority owner. Mistress exposed in corporate scandal." Talk shows dissected the drama, panelists leaning forward with hungry eyes. "It's Shakespearean," one commentator said. "Betrayal, humiliation, revenge, all in one story." But it wasn't just the media. It was the people closest to me, the ones who had stood silently as I suffered, now breaking their silence. Caroline called that night, her voice fierce with pride. "Marianne, you did it. I always knew you had more strength than they could see. Now the whole world knows too." Even neighbors who had once averted their eyes came knocking. Mrs. Carter from next door, who had watched me walk alone with pity in her eyes, hugged me tightly on my porch. "I'm sorry I didn't defend you sooner," she whispered, "but you've shown us all that silence can be broken." And then there was Daniel, my son. For weeks he had seemed distant, caught in her web, unable to see through the lies. But when he came to me after the boardroom explosion, his eyes red and voice trembling, I saw the boy I had raised, not the man she had tried to manipulate. "Mom," he said, standing in the doorway of my kitchen, "I didn't know. I didn't want to believe she was using us, using Dad. But today, when I saw the way she screamed, the way she looked at you, like she had lost everything, I realized who she really was, and who you really are." His voice broke. "I'm sorry I doubted you." I reached for his hand, held it tight. "You don't need to apologize, Daniel. The people who betray us the deepest are the ones who blind us first. What matters is that now you see." His tears fell, and in them I saw the crack of healing. The mistress had wanted to steal my son as well as my husband, but instead, her downfall returned him to me. The fire didn't stop at the company or my family. It spread into society itself. At church, women I barely knew pressed my hands, whispering, "You give us hope." At the bakery down the street, strangers I had never spoken to nodded with respect. Even in the supermarket, I overheard a woman telling her friend, "Did you hear about her? They called her old, useless, but she owned it all along. She made them pay." It wasn't gossip anymore. It was legend, a story people passed around because it was too delicious, too raw to ignore. The tale of the wife who was mocked and erased, who rose from humiliation to expose her betrayers. And with every retelling, my humiliation was rewritten into strength. My silence was recast as strategy. My pain became proof. Julian couldn't walk down the street without whispers trailing behind him. Men who had once envied him now shook their heads. "Imagine losing everything to the woman you tried to erase," they said. He stopped showing his face at company events, hiding behind curtains of shame. And she, his mistress, vanished from the city altogether, her name dragged through the mud on every social platform, her reputation burned to ash. The witnesses weren't just people in the room. They were everyone who had ever seen me endure humiliation and now saw the reversal. My revenge was no longer private. It had become communal, a fire shared by all who had once doubted me, now ignited by the truth. And as the flames spread, I realized something extraordinary. Revenge tastes sweetest when it is not whispered in dark rooms, but shouted from rooftops. Because then it is not just your story. It becomes everyone's warning. After the fire dies down, what remains is silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm when everything has been leveled. That was the aftermath of my reckoning. The mistress, once so loud, so brazen, so certain she'd already won, vanished like smoke. Her name was no longer whispered with admiration, but spat with disgust. Clients who had once indulged her calls refused to answer. Her so-called friends blocked her number. On the streets, people who had once envied her youth and boldness now shook their heads and muttered, "That's the woman who thought she could steal an empire and lost it all." The humiliation she had forced onto me had boomeranged back 100-fold, and I didn't have to lift another finger. Society itself devoured her arrogance. She was left not just without the company, not just without my husband, but without a place to stand. I almost pitied her. Almost. Julian's downfall was slower, more tragic. He tried to pretend nothing had changed, walking into the office as though his throne still belonged to him. But the looks were different now. The respect was gone. Executives avoided his gaze, whispering behind his back. Investors stopped returning his calls. His authority had been stripped bare, not by me alone, but by his own silence, his own cowardice. One evening he came to me, his eyes hollow, his voice cracked. "Marianne," he whispered, "I made a mistake. I should never have—" I raised a hand, silencing him. "You didn't make a mistake, Julian. You made a choice, and now you live with it." He broke then. Shoulders slumped, tears threatening. The man who had once carried himself like a king now looked like nothing more than a broken shadow. I didn't feel triumph watching him crumble. I felt something colder. Detachment. Whatever love had bound us had been buried long before. The community, too, rendered its verdict. At church, women who had once pitied me now smiled with admiration, while men shook Julian's hand with forced politeness, their eyes filled with quiet judgment. At neighborhood gatherings, whispers followed him, and when he walked into rooms, conversations halted. He wasn't just the man who betrayed his wife. He was the man who lost everything to the woman he thought was powerless. As for me, life did not become easy, but it became mine again. For the first time in decades, I walked into the company building not as someone's wife, not as someone's shadow, but as the rightful owner. Employees stood straighter when I passed. Some smiled with genuine respect. Others bowed their heads, ashamed they had ever overlooked me. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was no longer invisible. Even Daniel changed. My son, who had once seemed so distant, now stood beside me with quiet loyalty. He stopped mentioning her name, stopped defending his father's silences. Instead, he asked me how I wanted to run the company, offered to help where he could. "I'm with you, Mom," he said one night over dinner, and for the first time in months, I believed him. But aftermath is never only victory. It is also the wreckage you must step over. Nights were still heavy. Sometimes I woke from dreams of the past, of the man Julian had once been, of the girl I had once been, and grief clung to me like smoke. Betrayal leaves scars no revenge can erase. Yet even as I wept into the silence, I knew I had done what I needed to do. I had reclaimed myself. The mistress was ruined, my husband was disgraced, the world had seen the truth, and I, once mocked, humiliated, erased, was still standing. That was the aftermath. Not a clean ending, not a fairy tale, but survival. And survival, after everything, felt like victory. When the dust finally settled, I stood alone on the balcony of the office building, the city lights glittering beneath me like constellations I had finally claimed as my own. The wind tangled in my hair, carrying with it the echoes of all the voices that had once called me invisible, useless, old. Now those voices were silent, replaced by something new, respect, even awe. But the truth is, respect from others wasn't what healed me. What healed me was the reflection I saw in the glass that night, not the woman they had mocked, not the ghost they tried to erase, but me, whole, defiant, alive. I had weathered betrayal that would have crushed many. I had endured humiliation that might have silenced others forever. And still, I remained. Closure doesn't come in fireworks. It comes quietly, in the moments when you breathe and realize you're no longer carrying the weight of their lies. It comes when you look at the ruins of what was and feel no desire to rebuild it, because you're already building something new. Julian faded into the background of my life, a man who once promised me eternity, but gave me only betrayal. The mistress became nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered at parties, and me? I became a reminder that silence is not weakness, that dignity can be buried but never destroyed, that a woman's strength is most dangerous when underestimated. Sometimes, women from the community stop me on the street. They press my hands, their eyes shining, and they whisper, "You showed us it's possible." And I think that maybe this is the real legacy of what happened. Not the company, not the headlines, not the revenge, but the proof that no matter how deep the betrayal, no matter how cruel the humiliation, we can rise. I sit at my desk now with Daniel by my side, our work quiet but steady. There is laughter in the office again, small but genuine, and in that laughter I find peace. I no longer need to prove anything to them. I already proved it to myself. So I ask you, listening to my story, have you ever been underestimated, erased, humiliated? Have you ever been told you were nothing, only to discover that deep inside, you were holding the power all along? If you have, then you know what I know. That strength is born in the very place where others try to break you. That dignity, once reclaimed, burns brighter than any insult, and that revenge, when it comes, isn't about destroying them. It's about remembering yourself. This is my closure, my rebirth, my promise to never again let silence be mistaken for weakness. And now, I leave you with this. Don't let them erase you. Don't let them write you out of your own story. Rise. Take back what's yours and make them choke on their underestimation. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or the fire of rebirth, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Because stories like this travel further than we imagine, and each time we share them, we remind someone else that they are not alone. Don't forget to subscribe because I have more stories to tell, stories of betrayal, survival, and the quiet storms that live inside women, like us. Stories the world needs to hear. Until next time, with strength, with dignity, with truth.